By 1965, the Beatles had become untouchable. Every song they released climbed to the top of the charts. Every tour sold out before it began. But inside the walls of Abbey Road studios, something far more profound was happening. The band was growing up. The pop idols who sang "I Want to Hold Your Hand" were beginning to look inward, to write about memory, time, and meaning. And out of that reflection came a song so deeply personal, so achingly sincere, that it brought their producer George Martin to tears. That song was "In My Life." By late 1965, the Beatles were in the middle of recording their Rubber Soul album, a record that would redefine what pop music could be. They were experimenting with new sounds, deeper lyrics, and a maturity that surprised even themselves. John Lennon, in particular, was restless. He'd grown tired of simple love songs. He wanted to write something real, something that meant something. He later said, "I wanted to write about my life, about the places I remembered and the people who meant something to me." So he sat down with his notebook and began writing lines about Liverpool, Penny Lane, Strawberry Field, the friends he'd lost, the innocence that was gone. It wasn't nostalgia, it was reflection. When George Martin read the lyrics, he knew this was something different. This wasn't the voice of a pop star, it was the voice of a man confronting time. At first, "In My Life" was just a rough sketch, simple words, a melody forming in John's head. He brought it to the studio, where Paul helped refine the musical structure. The two shaped it together, balancing Lennon's melancholy with McCartney's instinct for melody. But even then, Lennon wasn't satisfied. He wanted the song to feel timeless, to sound like a memory. That's where George Martin came in. He suggested adding a middle section, something classical, something that could capture the passage of time. John agreed. Martin went home that night and began writing what would become one of the most haunting bridges in Beatles history. He recorded it using a harpsichord-like piano sound, achieved by playing a sped-up keyboard track, a technique that gave it a fragile, dreamlike quality. When Lennon heard it the next morning, he was silent for a long time. Finally, he said softly, "That's beautiful, George. That's exactly what I wanted." George Martin had worked with the band since the beginning, from their first session in 1962. He had seen them laugh, argue, and evolve. But "In My Life" was different. It wasn't about fame or love or rebellion, it was about truth. Martin later said, "It was so honest, so pure. It made me cry. Not because it was sad, but because it was real." For Martin, a man of classical training and emotional restraint, that moment was rare. The Beatles had written dozens of hits, but this one reached something deeper. He described the experience like watching his students surpass their teacher. "I realized they no longer needed me to make great music. They had found their voice. It was a bittersweet revelation, pride mixed with melancholy." In many ways, "In My Life" marked the true beginning of the Beatles' maturity as artists. Gone were the cheerful refrains of teenage romance. In their place was reflection, the kind of songwriting that looked backward to move forward. John's lyrics. "There are places I remember all my life, though some have changed," felt universal. Every listener could see their own past in them. Paul's harmonies gave it warmth. Ringo's drumming, soft and steady, held the song together like a heartbeat. And George Harrison's subtle guitar lines added an almost invisible tenderness. But it was George Martin's arrangement that gave the song its soul, turning it from a memory into a meditation. By the time Rubber Soul was finished, the Beatles had changed music forever. But for George Martin, "In My Life" was more than just a great song. It was a mirror. He saw himself reflected in it. A man who had spent years chasing perfection, suddenly realizing that beauty was born from imperfection. He later said, "It wasn't about clever production, it was about emotion. That's why I cried, because it said something true." Martin often called "In My Life" his favorite Beatles song, and even near the end of his life he spoke of it with reverence. "When I first heard John sing it, I thought, this is what art is meant to do. Today, In My Life is considered one of the Beatles' greatest achievements, a song that bridges pop and poetry, simplicity and depth. It has been played at weddings, funerals, and moments of remembrance around the world. Every generation finds something in it: nostalgia, love, gratitude, or loss. John Lennon once called it "my first real major piece of work," and George Martin, years later, still described it the same way. It's the first Beatles song that made me cry, not out of sadness, but because it was honest. And honesty is the rarest thing in music. In the end, in my life wasn't about Liverpool or youth or even the Beatles. It was about the quiet truth that everything changes, and that beauty lies in remembering. George Martin saw that truth the moment he heard it. He didn't just produce the song, he felt it. And for a man who spent his life shaping sound, this was the one moment where the sound shaped him. There are places I remember. For George Martin, that place was Abbey Road, and the moment when four young men stopped being a pop band and became immortal.